Hello and welcome to the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor. This week is part 2 of high school experience, at least for me. So last week I spoke about the logistics of how I learned, how I studied, did exams, all that kind of jazz. And this week I was going to talk a bit more about my school life and the socializing that was kind of impacted by my loss of vision. So we're going to get into that. It may be a little bit of a longer one, so bear with me. We'll see how this plays out. Also, I'm aware that a lot of this happened to a lot of people at high school regardless of disability. So I'm definitely not claiming that it was just me, but it is just my experiences. So just a little disclaimer out there. But yeah, I just wanted to be straight about that. All right, so as I said last week, I was the first person in my school to be blind, and I was also the first person in my school to go blind while at school. So that was a big first. I also mentioned that some teachers didn't believe me, and probably some students or classmates didn't either. I'm not really sure. But I also had the added thing of I had itinerant teachers, which I spoke about last week, and I mentioned that they are teachers who help people with specific disabilities in the school system. And unfortunately, as good as they are and as good as they were, I had itinerant teachers who had only ever had a blind student who had been blind from birth or who had lost their eyesight very, very young in life to the point where they couldn't really remember seeing at all. So with me, there was a brand new territory, and unfortunately, this kind of meant that she was aware of how to kind of help me out and stuff like that, but she wasn't, it wasn't her job to take care of the psychological part. But obviously there was a psychological component because I was in the grieving process. And that's not to shit on anybody in that position because everyone's just trying to do their job and do the best they can. So was I. But unfortunately, it was just a reality of the situation that I was needing to learn how to do things at the same time as kind of grieving and wanting, and basically in complete denial that it was happening. So that was kind of the situation from that point of view. So in terms of my school life, the first thing that really happened was, don't forget, I was 12, so I was in my first year of high school, and a lot of people started to go distant. So I'd have friends. I used to play a lot of sports. I used to play with all the guys down on the oval every lunchtime. That was basically what we did. And unfortunately, what kind of happened was that obviously drifted away because I couldn't do that. But people sort of didn't really know what to say to me or how to interact. So they just didn't interact. And at the time, I took it very personally because I didn't really know how to compute it otherwise. But in hindsight, you're talking about 12-year-olds or teenagers in general. It's an awkward situation, and the easiest thing for people to do in an awkward situation when you're that age and immature is to just remove yourself from the situation. Now, as I'm older, I understand that. But at the time, from my point of view, that kind of just meant that I was isolated. The other side of that as well is because I couldn't see people properly, or at a certain point not at all, I actually didn't know who was around me to start a conversation. And because other people had stopped talking to me and I had internalized that as because I had lost my sight, which it was basically in its own way, I was kind of convinced that nobody wanted to talk to me, so then I wouldn't start a conversation. But I also didn't want to make the mistake of not knowing who I was talking to. So there was a lot of embarrassment from my point of view of the fact that I needed to act a certain way, and I didn't want people to have to tell me their names when they came into a room or came beside me, because 6 months ago, that wasn't the case, or not even 6 months ago, that wasn't the case. So from my point of view, as somebody that age, I wanted things to stay as normal as possible, but that wasn't what happened. and it couldn't have happened. The other side of it as well is that by this point, I was brand new to having a lack of vision or no vision, so I didn't know everybody's voices because up until that point, I knew everybody by their faces. And considering I'd never really had to pay attention to that skill, I was surrounded by people that I might have been friends with or classmates with, but I'd never really given a lot of attention to their voices beforehand because I could always see their face to know who was who. And all of a sudden, I'm in a situation where I'm not actually sure. And the last thing in that situation I want to look like is dumb because I already feel like I look a certain way. I'm already feeling outcast and isolated. So basically, I didn't say anything because I didn't want it to look any more weird than I already was. And again, unfortunately, that just led to more isolation. It's one of those things. There is no one right, healthy way to deal with this. Everybody has their process. Everybody's in different environments. Some are better, some are worse. It depends on the people around you, the support you get, the resources you have. So when you're essentially in a grieving period where I was, but also from other children's point of view, they aren't equipped for that either. Again, it took me a long time to come to that realization because I just thought they were pricks. But that's how it was. There is no manual for this kind of stuff. I also mentioned last week as well, just about the basic things of being in a classroom where everyone's joking around, everyone's trying to see how much they can get away with. And yes, while that's not proper, that's all part of school life when you're that age. But because I had a teacher's assistant beside me who was just there for me, obviously people couldn't be joking around if they were sitting near me because there was essentially two teachers in the room and one of them nearby all the time. So that's another factor where probably people didn't really want to sit nearby because they'd have another guy saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. So not only could I not join in, but then I was in the vicinity of this authority figure, and that's the last thing anybody wants at school because we're just that age. The flip side of this, which I guess is to be expected, unfortunately, is that I started getting bullied because that's high school, unfortunately. Not to undermine it or belittle it or understate it because it's not okay, but unfortunately that's just the nature of the beast. So the first real incident I can think of that sort of stuck in my mind was I was a couple of months into losing my vision, so I couldn't see people's faces anymore and I couldn't see the bus number, but I could just about walk around on my own and basically that kind of stuff, but I couldn't see a lot of detail. Again, couldn't see people's faces or anything like that. All that central vision was really, really blurry and almost non-existent. And a few times I had missed my bus because I couldn't see the number on the bus and it had just gone. So a year 12 student who was 17, he was on the same bus as me and he was assigned basically to make sure I got on the bus every afternoon and I didn't accidentally miss it. So in this particular case, I think I got on the bus and he wasn't there that day, but I got on the bus and I was sitting next to somebody and a guy that was in a year or two above me. That's usually how it happens. There's hazing on the bus from to the years below because we're the midgets and the little people and the new ones on the scene. But this guy, for whatever reason, decided to throw his bag on my lap and say, hey, mind it. And I just put it on the ground and said no, because he was just being a bit of a jerk about it. But obviously he knew that I couldn't really see well at that point. So he started throwing the bag back at me and I couldn't see it coming. But then he also started slapping me around the face because, again, I couldn't see it coming. And it was my first real encounter with something called the bystander effect. So the bystander effect, for anybody who doesn't know, is basically a group of people seeing something happen and everybody thinks somebody should do something about that. But there's plenty of people here, so I don't really feel that I should be the one to step in because there's so many other people to step in. And what happens is everybody thinks that way, so nobody steps in. And that's how things get walked by, and other people don't want to get involved because they might cop it and all that kind of stuff. That's basically how the psychology of it works. So I was on a bus full of 50 people and everybody was just quiet watching this happen, and nobody really stepped in. And as a 12-year-old, obviously not understanding the bystander effect, to me that was a massive betrayal, because I was brought up to believe that people would step in and that kind of stuff would annoy other people or make them interject or whatever, and that's not what happened. And unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, it was only a couple of weeks later, or maybe a month later, that I actually couldn't use the bus anymore. One, for that reason, because it had kind of scared me, obviously, as it would. But it had also, in my mind, shown me a side of other people that I didn't like, because, again, as a 12-year-old, nobody comes to back you up. So when you don't know any better, again, you internalize that the way you're internalizing everything else, and basically telling yourself everybody must agree with him or whatever it might be. And that's basically how it worked in my mind. Again, rightly or wrongly, but that's how it worked. So basically from that point onwards, I had to get special transport to and from school. I'd get dropped off at the office in the morning and picked up from the office in the afternoon, because I couldn't get the bus and I wasn't willing to learn how to get the bus because of what happened, because I didn't want to be in the middle of a war zone, basically. So the other kinds of things that I would come across would be people wordlessly tapping my shoulder to mess with me. I would have people stealing things from my bag or opening my bag when I wouldn't know it. I would have people waving stuff in my face in front of everybody else, and obviously I wouldn't know that they were waving in my face, to kind of mess with me or see what I could see or see if I would catch them at it. I'd have people trip me over, which was fun. And I would also have people basically talk about me, and sometimes it would be talking about me so I could hear them, and other times I would hear people talking about me when they probably didn't realize that I could hear them, and then getting an impression for what they actually thought, which, yeah, was delightful, as you can imagine. So I haven't really mentioned too much about moving independently around school, and a lot of that came back to the bullying and what happened on the bus, because I was learning how to use a cane, but in my mind, firstly, I didn't want to use the cane because it was so new to me, and I kind of thought I would stick out like, I don't know, whatever sticks out. And that was the last thing I wanted, because I already felt that I was sticking out. And so in my mind, if I was walking around on my own, I was just going to be an easy target for more of what I was getting already. So while I could use a cane and I learned how to use it proficiently by the time I was 13 or 14, psychologically, I wasn't able to use it because I was basically terrified of what might happen and the repercussions, not in terms of me falling or anything like that, but in terms of other people. And because of that, initially, when this all happened in year 7 and year 8, I would hold on to classmates' bags. So I would literally walk right behind them, put both hands on their school bag and walk right behind them. But obviously that looks weird, and it's really not the tried and tested way of holding on to somebody and doing sighted guide, which is the correct term when somebody is blind or vision impaired, walking with somebody who is sighted. So the right way to do it is to hold somebody by the elbow. I'd have my index finger and my thumb holding somebody just above the elbow and walking along with them. again, though, the politics of school, particularly at that time, and the fact that I was a guy meant that a lot of guys weren't particularly thrilled about the prospect of another guy holding them just above the elbow, because it kind of seemed a bit feminine or whatever. And at the time, unfortunately, thankfully we've moved past this to a large degree, but the worst thing you could be called or be accused of at that time in school as a guy was being gay, or somebody would call you a fag or whatever it might be. So obviously I didn't want that, and nobody around me wanted that. So my compromise was basically that I would put my hand on a shoulder, because it just seemed a little bit more masculine, which is idiotic to say now, but at the time, and given the fact that we were dumb and immature and all that kind of stuff, that's just the way it was. Another dynamic to this was that I was lonely and isolated, so I wanted who I had been friends with to assist me if I needed to go to the bathroom or get to class. And obviously from my point of view, that was kind of fulfilling two roles, because I was getting where I needed to get, but it also gave me one-on-one time with somebody who had become distant, and somebody who I knew whose name was, and in my mind that was ticking several boxes. Unfortunately, in hindsight, again, which is a great thing, I probably relied on some of them too much, and they probably had their own feelings about it. And again, from my point of view, at the time, all I knew was that I was trying to survive, and I was trying to not be alone and isolated. And just like them, in terms of the bullying, we don't really have a good grasp at that age of what other people may be experiencing. We just know what we're experiencing, and we don't have a good concept of how to think beyond that. And basically, because this was happening and I was trying to go to the same people or classmates, then some parents started to complain that this was happening. And again, naturally, I internalized that to be something personal, because I didn't really have anything else to attach it to. I didn't really know how to rationalize it any other way. So again, it came down to, well, it's me, it's because I'm blind, I can't do anything about this, and here's another thing that's kind of being taken off me or is also out of my control. Also, I just want to say, this isn't meant to be a woe is me or anything like that. I'm just explaining what happened and my point of view at the time. So obviously now that I'm older, I have different point of views. I've been able to look back on it a bit differently, but I'm just explaining how it was at the time. So yeah, now that I'm older, I feel for them, because they were doing something that was a bit different as well. But again, from my point of view, I was in a war zone and was just trying to survive the best way I could. So eventually, that system basically turned into a full-on roster system of who was to take me where and when at what time of the school day. I can't really remember why that came into practice. Maybe it was because of what I just explained. I can't exactly remember why that came in. But basically, this sort of roster schedule was set up so that it wasn't being all on a couple of people. And especially when we all start having different classes, it's different when you're in the first year or two of high school, because you're all going to the same classes. But once you start having different electives, then you're having classes at different times in different places with different people. So naturally, it doesn't really work. And the roster schedule that was developed, it worked quite well. It exposed me to new people, because it was other people in the school who kind of volunteered to help out. So that was a big thing for me, because it made me realize that there were actually some decent people in the school, and it also gave me a chance to meet these people where I otherwise may have never known they even existed. As I said, it worked quite well, but these things can have a downside, and they did. So there was often several times where I would basically be standing there and several people would be arguing in front of me about whose turn it was to take me because they didn't want to have to take me. And again, from their point of view, totally understandable, but from my point of view and with everything else that was going on, all that was telling me was I'm a burden, I'm a pain in the ass, and it was pretty scarring, unfortunately, for the lack of a better word. And it's weird, even 15 plus years later, that concept of being a burden still really weighs heavy on me. And it's weird and sad, unfortunately, how much of our early experiences really dictate long into our lives. But that's what happened. Several times, because of this happening, I was actually left out in the playground on my own during class time. So again, probably that bystander effect. Somebody thought somebody was getting me, so nobody got me. And I think one time, I can remember one or two times where I literally was out in the playground from the end of short lunch, the first short lunch, to big lunch. So I wasn't actually in class, and I don't know if any of the teachers noticed, but nobody ever came for me. And I don't really know what happened there. So again, from my point of view, with everything else that's happening, that's just telling me I'm not really wanted, or I'm not really on anyone's radar, or I'm too much of a pain in the ass, too much to handle, whatever that might be. So again, I don't really know why that happened, and it might have innocent reasons behind it, but again, when you're that age, that's not how you take it on board at all. A big shining light in all this was a friend that I had actually made in year 7, and he and I were kind of both loners in our own way, but we basically started hanging out. And I'm sure all of this stuff impacted on him in his own way because he was helping me out so much, but he seemed to have much less of a problem with it than others because he maybe didn't really have anywhere else to go either, because neither of us were exactly popular. Even when I could see, we were just sort of the hangers on to the crowds. So he really helped me get through a lot of high school because we would hang out at lunch and he was just a go-to. And sadly, unfortunately, we're not as close as we used to be, but I'll never forget the fact that he was there in a situation where I felt a lot of other people weren't. So Brendan, if you ever listen to this, you know how I feel. But naturally, Brendan had other classes to go to, and it wasn't always practical for him, and he had his own life to live and all that kind of stuff, which is totally understandable. So some of those other things needed to take place, which I described with the rosters and other people. Now, unfortunately, in year 10, or at the end of year 10, he was going to go to another school. And at the time, I really didn't want that because it was my only really constant friend, but it was also my way around, and that was a lot of pressure to put on him. But again, at the time, I didn't really probably see it like that. And while it was horrible and I didn't think I'd survive, it was good in a way because it took the pressure off him, and it also made me realize that I needed to find other options and other solutions, and we could just be mates rather than being sort of me leaning on him, which in some ways he was happy to do. But again, it's different when there is no other options. So it was good because then we could just be friends. So basically, as an overall snapshot of all of this that was going on, I became quite difficult to handle. So with teachers, or with the teachers who were trying to help me, and God love them, they were just trying to help me, but I felt things were so absolutely out of my own control and everything was dictated by somebody else, or what somebody else thought of me, or whatever it might be, that I definitely had moments where I just completely snapped. I had a moment, I think, where I told the assistant principal to go fuck himself, and obviously in a Catholic school that doesn't really go down too well. But I was just at breaking point several times, more than several times. And I know, again, everybody can get like that at high school, because high school, for most people, if not all people, is just a horrible, horrible place. It's like the worst kind of powder keg you can imagine. Well, at least that I can imagine. So that's kind of what happened. So I probably became a miserable little prick, because I was a miserable little prick, and then I became an angry, miserable little prick. The consequences of that lack of control as well then led me to eating poorly, because it was like each meal was almost the only part of my day that was under my own control, and I could choose what was going into my own mouth. And it's just comfort eating, and a lot of people do it, but that's basically what happened, because I'd have somebody who would bring me to school who I didn't want to have to bring me to school, because I didn't want to have to go that way. I'd have to stay at the office until somebody else came and got me. And then I'd have the experience at school either in class learning or socially, and then repeat in the afternoon of waiting for somebody to pick me up. And the people who picked me up and dropped me off, because of the child protection rules, they weren't even allowed to pick me up from home and drop me off at home, even as a teenager. When I got to 15, 16, 17, they would have to drop me off at somebody else's house who would look after me until my mum came home from work. So from my point of view, absolutely everything was out of my own control. So I started eating shit, because it was the only part of my day that actually made me feel nice. Again, when you're just trying to survive and you're internalizing and personalizing everything, this is just what happens. As I said, there is no map. And unfortunately, some of the resources or help that I later found out are available, I didn't know was available, and neither did my mother. So we didn't demand them, because if you don't know something, you can't ask for it. So that was unfortunately just how it was. So anyway, as you can imagine, I couldn't wait to get out of high school. I almost dropped out several times, more than several times. But I couldn't wait to get out of high school, because it was just like that most of the time. And thankfully, I realized when I left high school that high school isn't the real world. You think it is, because up until that point, all you've ever known is school life, and school life can be pretty horrible. Not that life outside school can't be horrible, but all that kind of social bullcrap and immaturity doesn't really exist. And if it does exist in the adult world, it doesn't get tolerated in the same way as it does in a school situation when you're younger. So once I got out, it was like literally coming up out of the ocean after drowning. It was just like, oh my God, that's over. I can breathe. And then once I started doing adult education, like adult education sounds like something nefarious, but once I started doing TAFE in university, and I realized that kind of stuff doesn't fly, and you have to be more mature and higher things are expected of you, then I realized that that wasn't how things would always be. But as I said, again, that kind of stuff really sticks with you, even though you know the situation has changed. Your emotions and your memory don't really work like that. They're not logical. You remember bad things, unfortunately, better than you remember good things, and you usually remember them in the developmental part of life. So that's why most of us remember stuff from really young, because that's the stuff that sticks with us. I also weirdly don't really remember high school as vividly as I remember primary school, which is weird because high school is more recent in terms of time, but I can remember primary school much clearer, much more vividly than I remember high school. So some of that is probably me not wanting to remember and blocking that off, but it's a weird little phenomenon because you just wouldn't think that would be the case. And just to wrap up, I then unfortunately later found out in life that a lot of other people who were blind who went to high school didn't have anywhere near the experiences I did. They didn't really experience that same level of bullying and the school or the resources not really keeping up. I'm sure some of them did, but I just happened to meet ones who all told me they didn't really experience anything I did. So that helped, as you can imagine, because you're like, well, hang on, well, why did you get it? So I guess it all comes down to who surrounds you, what school you're at, what's going on, and I suppose your own state of mind and everybody else's. But it was interesting to hear that later on and go, oh, cool, that's great. Not that you want everybody to have experienced those kinds of things, but when you find out everybody else didn't, or not everybody else, that's generalizing, but when you find out at least the people you've met didn't, you kind of go, well, that really sucks in its own way. So again, thanks for listening. I hope that wasn't too depressing or anything. I've been contemplating whether I'd talk about it for a while, but obviously bullying and mental health and all these kinds of things, they are big things that impact everybody no matter what age of life. And I don't mean it to be a woe is me and, oh, Connor had such a hard life and all this kind of stuff. But it's just what happened, and it happened as a part of the fact that I lost my sight, and that's kind of relevant to the show. So I just wanted to be honest about it and explain it the best way I could. So anyway, as always, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can email blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram if you search for Blindseye Podcast. I'm on Twitter @BlindseyePod. And if you want one central place to find all this stuff and all the previous episodes, just go to blindseyepodcast.com. So thanks very much for listening, and I will be back next week. Cheers.